Subscribe for more mysteries, unsolved and unexplained.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving into an explainer on one of Germany's most chilling and honestly most perplexing unsolved mysteries. We're talking about the 1922 Hinterkaifeck farmstead murders. I'm really thrilled to guide you through this today because we're going to break down exactly how a century-old cold case continues to absolutely captivate and terrify us. We'll be looking at the facts, the actual physical artifacts, and the enduring theories left behind. So let's jump right in. First, I want you to just picture this scenario for a second. What would you do if you realized an intruder, a literal killer, might already be waiting for you inside your own home? It sounds like the plot of a late-night horror movie, right? But this was the very real, terrifying reality for the Gruber family in the days leading up to their deaths. This case hits on some of our deepest, most primal fears: isolation, the unknown, and that horrifying thought that the threat is already inside the house with you.
All right, let's start with Section 1, the isolated farmstead.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer vulnerability of this family, we have to understand the stark isolation of where they lived. So, setting the scene here. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead was located about 70 kilometers, roughly an hour's drive, north of Munich in rural Bavaria. It was this lonely property bordered by dense, imposing woods, sitting just behind a small hamlet called Kaifeck. The household was made up of 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, who was known to be a pretty harsh guy with a bad temper, his 72-year-old wife Kadzilia, their 35-year-old widow daughter Victoria, Victoria's two young kids, 7-year-old Kazelia and 2-year-old Josef, and their maid. They kept to themselves, way out there on their own, meaning if they ever needed help, it definitely wasn't coming quickly.
Moving on to Part 2, Omens and the Murders.
The massacre that happened on March 31, 1922, wasn't just some sudden, out-of-the-blue ambush. It was actually the culmination of a creeping, terrifying dread. Looking at the events, it becomes horrifyingly clear that the killer was likely already living inside the home, just watching the family, long before they actually struck. Get this, 6 months before the murders, their maid at the time, Crescence Rieger, quit in an absolute panic. She swore the house was haunted because she kept hearing unexplained noises up in the attic. Fast forward to the days right before the crime. Andreas finds footprints in the fresh snow leading straight from the forest to the farm's machine room door. But, and here's the really scary part, there were no tracks leading back out. To make matters worse, they were hearing footsteps above them at night, and several house keys mysteriously vanished. Then, on the afternoon of March 31st, a brand new maid, Maria Baumgardner, arrives for her very first day. And tragically, by the end of the night, she and the entire family would be dead.
So how did it actually go down? The events of that night are just as brutal as they are bizarre. Sometime that evening, the killer, or killers, lured Andreas, his wife Kazelia, their daughter Victoria, and little 7-year-old Kazelia out to the barn, one by one, where they were bludgeoned to death. And autopsies later revealed a truly heartbreaking detail. The 7-year-old survived the initial attack for hours, actually tearing out clumps of her own hair in terror as she lay in the hay. After the barn, the killer moved into the house, murdering sleeping 2-year-old Josef in his bassinet and the new maid Maria in her bed. But the aftermath? That's what really haunts this case. The murderer didn't just run away, they stayed. For days, they fed the cattle, ate the family's entire supply of bread, carved meat from the pantry, and kept the fire going. Neighbors literally saw smoke coming from the chimney. The killer was just living there, side by side with the 6 bodies they had just created.
Which brings us to Section 3, Artifacts and the Investigation.
Incredibly, 4 whole days went by before anyone realized something was wrong. When neighbors finally found the bodies and the cops showed up, they were handed a baffling crime scene and just a few strange physical clues. And the initial police work, led by an inspector, George Ringgruber, was, well, disastrously compromised. Before they could lock down the area, locals were just wandering freely through the crime scene. They were moving the bodies, they were shifting evidence around. Believe it or not, people were actually cooking and eating meals in the farm's kitchen, literally steps away from the victims. It completely contaminated the site, taking an already tough puzzle and making it almost impossible to solve.
Let's look at the actual evidence left behind, starting with the murder weapon. It was a mattock, a really heavy, brutal farming tool used for digging and chopping. And the twisted part is, it belonged to the Grubers. A former farmhand, George Siegel, actually admitted later on that he'd carved the handle for that very tool while he worked there. It was used on all 6 victims, but it wasn't even found immediately. It turned up a whole year later, stashed away in the barn loft when the farm was finally being torn down.
Then you've got those missing house keys we talked about. Several of them just vanished a few days before the attack. So, what does this actually mean for the case? It strongly suggests the intruder meticulously planned the whole thing and secured completely unrestricted access to the house. They could move around freely, maybe hanging out in the attic or the machine room while the family slept right underneath them.
And we can't forget the mystery newspaper. Right before the murders, Andreas found a Munich newspaper on his property. Initially, he just figured the postman dropped it, but investigators later confirmed that absolutely no one in the area subscribed to that paper. So you have this completely out-of-place artifact from 70 kilometers away. It was essentially a dark omen that a total stranger had already crossed onto their property and brought a piece of the outside world with them.
Finally, there's a penknife that was found during the farm's demolition in 1923, and who it belonged to is still a massive question mark. The old maid, Crescence, said she'd seen it in the yard back when she worked there, so maybe it was just the family's. But then, decades later, in 1971, a woman claimed a suspect named Andreas S. had lost his penknife during the murders. Like so many things in this investigation, it's a clue that points in several totally conflicting directions.
Let's dive into Part 4, A Century of Suspects.
Now, establishing a motive here is tough because robbery clearly wasn't the goal. A large chunk of the family's cash was found totally untouched. So, over the last century, a massive suspect list has been put together. Let's look at the heavy hitters. First up, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was a neighbor, rumored to be Victoria's lover, and possibly even the father of baby Josef. He obviously knew the farm well. The really suspicious part? When he was with the search party that found the bodies, he managed to unlock the front door without a key and went inside alone, keeping in mind the killer could have easily still been there. Next is Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband. He was officially reported dead in World War I, but his body was never found. Years later, rumors started flying that a German-speaking Soviet officer was bragging about committing the murders, making people wonder if Karl survived, came back, and took revenge. And lastly, there's a wild theory by author Bill James about Paul Mueller, a transatlantic serial killer. James points out that Mueller's MO in America is an identical match, targeting isolated farming families, using the blunt edge of a tool like a pickaxe, stacking the bodies and leaving valuables behind. Crazy to think about, right?
But to be fair, we also have to neutrally weigh some other names pulled straight from the historical files. On one side, you have the Gump brothers, Adolf and Anton. They were looked into early on because of their ties to a far-right paramilitary group, the Freikorps Oberland. Their own sister even claimed on her deathbed that they did it, though Anton was eventually let go because of a lack of hard proof. On the other side, suspicion fell on various local laborers, guys like Peter Weber, who supposedly talked about killing Andreas for his money, or the Bischler brothers, who the former maid said were asking highly suspicious questions about the family's wealth and sleeping arrangements. So plenty of people had the opportunity, but definitively tying any of them to that bloody Maddock, it proved impossible.
And finally, Section 5, The Enduring Legacy.
So where does this leave us today? How does a case from 1922 still have such a massive grip on us? Well, less than a year after the massacre, the farm was completely torn down by locals who were just desperate to erase this horrific memory from their town. Today, all that's left in those empty Bavarian fields is a solemn concrete memorial. But the investigation didn't just fade away. In 2007, a group of 15 police academy students actually reviewed the case using modern criminal techniques. They ultimately concluded that because of the lack of professional forensics back then, like proper fingerprinting, the killer can probably never be identified in a court of law. But here is the wild part. All the authors of the report independently agreed on exactly who the main suspect was. However, out of respect for that suspect's living descendants, they have kept the name officially unreleased.
Which brings us to the ultimate, chilling reality of Hinterkaifeck. 6 lives ended, 0 definitive answers. We're just left to wonder if the truth behind those footsteps in the snow will forever remain a ghost story. It leaves us with a lingering question that really gets under your skin. If the evidence was buried in the snow a century ago, what other secrets are still hiding out there in the dark? And honestly, maybe what terrifies us the most isn't just that the crime is unsolved, but that it's a permanent reminder of our absolute deepest fear, the intruder who is already inside. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep seeking the truth, and I'll see you next time.